Would you say that overly sensitive parents, parents who don't want to upset their child's sentiments,
Mhm.
can in many ways harm their children in the same way that some tyrannical parents can?
Definitely. It's
And how does this happen?
so often it happens because there's a lack of balance,
Hmm.
right? So if you have a more nurturing mother and a weak father, well, the weak father never checks the nurturing mother when she goes too far. And so nothing changes. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. So it becomes, well, they don't want to go to school today. It's just drips and drabs of allowing the child to dictate themselves and what they want to do. And in extreme circumstance, it becomes, well, we'll let them smoke weed in the house because it's better if they smoke it here if they're going to do it anyways,
Yeah, yeah,
right? It becomes that kind of rationalization because they never want to push the child, and they never want to deal with a child who is upset that they're being enforced rules, but they need to have rules enforced. And ultimately what will happen is they'll grow up to resent their parents because every child, I don't care who they are, I don't care what they say, every child, if you let your child smoke weed in your house and do drugs, they know they're not supposed to do that, right? And so what they interpret it as, like, your friends might come over, oh, your parents are cool, they let us drink and do drugs. But every kid would be like, my parents don't care about me enough to tell me no. And that is something that is very profound. And you'll see that in affluent families all the time, where the parents, they got a lot of money, they have a lot of access to stuff, and they're busy and stuff like that. So it's just easier. Yeah, you want this, sure. And so that's where you see, like, they'll crash the car, and their parents will give them a new car. Like, there's no repercussions. They're never told no, and they become resentful, and they become spoiled, and they become drudges on our society. And these are also, like, in many cases, like the Gen Z kids who end up in a workforce where they crumble when their boss says you did this wrong. And it's like, no one ever tells me I'm doing it wrong. And they never get the bite sides of reality when they were kids. And a quick story: my son was very young. I think he was like 2 or 3. He played like this little game, and he would get really pissed off if he lost, like just like moping. And it was so much so I was like, that's not good. So I started introducing bite-sized disappointments to him. So he would come in like, can I have a cookie? And I would say no. And he would mope at first. But then every time he got better with it, to the point where he was just like, okay. And he just moved on. And so much so, like, there were times where he would ask, I'd say no. He was like, okay, move on. 15 minutes later, I give him a cookie and tell him it's because of how he responded to that. But from there, that those bite-sized disappointments, he got better. So much so that there are things that happen in his life where you have to move and things would change. And he just takes it in stride because he learned in a very small bite-sized way that life doesn't go the way that you want it to go.
Right. So I have a very important question right now,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is going to be very interesting. So we're talking about ideal families and families that deviate from that ideal, and ideal ways to raise a child, and child raising methods that deviate from it.
All right.
But let's say that someone has grown up in a setting that is far from the ideal,
Right.
a setting that sometimes may involve, as you said, lots of psychological pain. What is your advice for people of the sort who may view things entirely pessimistically? Would you say that there is room for optimism? And if yes, what would your advice be for becoming more optimistic and actually improving your life and improving your mindset?
Well, I'm an example of that. Um, I became the father that I would have wanted when I was a kid. And when my son was born, I said, I don't want to be my father. That was the number one thing. And I had to figure out how to be a man and how to be a father on my own. So if I can do it, other people can do it. But I would say the number one thing is you don't have to become the very thing that you despise when you were a kid. Like you don't. And your potential as a human being can grow as long as that's what you want. I do think that you have to be optimistic, and maybe you look for other examples. Maybe my book is an example where you see like this person was able to change their life by doing these things, and they did struggle, and it wasn't easy, but it is possible. Um, so I would say it is more than likely for you to change your life and to change the trajectory for your family, essentially in the cycle, right? In the cycle of dysfunction. So if your parents were alcoholics and drug use and all these different things, you recognize that that had a negative impact on your life. Well, your childhood doesn't have to determine your future as a parent. You can say, it ends with me, and I'm going to do something different. And because I don't want my child to go through what I went through. And that was my number one thing. I never wanted my son to ask, does my father love me or care about me? He knows by my actions, by my involvement, by me telling him how much I'm proud of him, how much I love him. He knows. He doesn't have to question these things. And so that was my number one objective. So if someone grew up in a not very ideal situation, of course, they can definitely change this trajectory. They don't have to rely off of fear, because a lot of people are like that. I do think that there are people who are fearful of repeating the mistakes of their parents. And so for some of them, they don't want kids. I think a lot of the rhetoric from people who are saying, I don't want children. And when you listen to the reasons why, it sounds very specific, right? It's almost like they're telling their story. Whereas someone who grew up in a happy and healthy household, they want children. Why? Because they have an example where it was happy and healthy. So I do think that a lot of people are making decisions about family based off of fear, based off of what happened to them as children. And it's that thing that they don't want to have happen. And they almost feel like, I'm going to end up doing the same thing. And it's like, no, you don't have to.
So you said basically that it's absolutely up to them to not replicate the things their parents did,
Right.
and that they should break the mentality of the self-fulfilling prophecy
Exactly.
by, in a sense, practicing this, by not being the parent their parents were.
Yeah.
But if that is the latter stage, what about the former? How do they break that mindset before they end up having a family?
Well,
What are the ways of thinking you think are really important for them to have and to practice, for them to break the mindset? Because if the ideal family, as you mentioned in the beginning, involves a historical process,
yeah,
which itself involves planning, it seems like they need to have sorted this out before they start.
correct. That's
Is it,
ideal.
does it work this way, or do we find it as we go along?
Well, I think for one, the fact that this person does not want to repeat puts them in a great spot.
Good.
Because they're mindful of it. I think my issue is when people are just doing things and it's just happening and they're not thinking about these things. The fact that they're mindful, how I was raised was not good. I don't want that for my child. That will be the basis of everything that they do moving forward, right? So they're less likely to screw up their kids and repeat the mistakes that their parents did, because they already have that in mind. I think a good practice for all parents is to occasionally remember what it was like for them as a kid, right? Because if they do that, they'll give their kids some grace. And it's like, oh, I remember when I was a kid. Like, I get it. So if your kid messes up, it's not the end of the world. You remember when you messed up as a kid? And you give them some grace and you can kind of move forward. So for the child who grew up in a dysfunctional household and they're about to potentially become parents, for them to remember what it was like for them as a kid, and it's like, oh, when they did that, I'm not going to do that, right? And maybe their parents, there's 80% that they did that was right, but there's 20% that was dysfunctional. Well, just don't do the 20%. Like, improve on that. There are many of the things that my mother did that I try to replicate, and I think it was good. And there are some things that I don't agree with, and those are the things that I try to alter moving forward. But it's more likely, if you are telling yourself that narrative that you do not want to be your parents, that you will likely not do that thing. But if you are mindless, you're going to do the things that are familiar and comfortable, even if they're detrimental.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.